Good evening, it's 6 o'clock, we'll get started right on time. Before we get started, we just have a couple of housekeeping things to go over. Your emergency exits are to each side of you. There are clips on the door, so in the case of an emergency, please wait for a staff member of Discover Dixon or Northwest Territory to take those clips off. We have cookies and water, complimentary. Please help yourself before, after, throughout the presentation. Also over there, you'll notice some items. These are all items that are available at the Dixon Welcome Center. Please check those out. You can purchase tonight or come back and visit at another time. I am Amanda White. I'm the Executive Director at Discover Dixon, and I just want to thank you all for making your way out here on this rainy evening tonight. Very excited to introduce our speaker for the evening. This former Dixon mayor will tell the remarkable story of Father John and Rebecca Dixon. In this one-hour presentation, Jim Dixon, a direct descendant of John and Rebecca, will reveal the highlights of his research for the Dixons of Dixon, his recent book. This presentation includes images of rare photos and documents as it describes the motivations and trials of the Dixons' long journey to the area, highlighting their confrontations with indigenous tribes, their pivotal role in founding Dixon in 1830, and how they lost everything and much more. Please give a warm welcome to our speaker, Mr. James Dixon.
Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. I hope your interest would be satisfied with my presentation. I hope you will enjoy it. I want to thank Amanda and her crew for arranging all of this. I think the Dixon Chamber and you're going to have to put up with my brain. Getting close to 85, I'm starting to skip a few beats here and there. But the Main Street program, Northwest Territories Museum, all these people are just wonderful for our community. They keep the interest in the city and the surrounding area alive. I especially want to thank Tom Wadsworth. I'm sure most of you know Tom, up-and-coming historian. There's wonderful stories in the Telegraph. Read every one. They're very, very interested and well-researched. The importance to me is he put together this whole program. I have a flip phone, so I'm not the kind of guy that can do this kind of stuff. I'm lucky to actually transfer it into my computer. During the pandemic, when we were all locked up in our homes, I started a couple of little projects. One I didn't think would be much, and that was to update my great-uncle George C. Dixon's family history. Now, the history part of his work was only about 6 pages, so I didn't think it would be a big deal. Most of it was a genealogical study of John and Rebecca Dixon. So when I realized it was only about 6 pages, I knew it was short, but I didn't know it was that short. I had it updated from 1955, and so I just started doing more research. I first went back and verified that what they said was correct, and quite a bit of it was not. And I came up with a book 150 pages long. Now, I can't shrink 150 pages into 1 hour. So what we're going to do is I'm going to try to move along as quickly as I can. first John Dixon, who came to America, was a private soldier in the English Army. I don't know anything about his service here, but when the Revolution was over, he settled in Rye, New York, and he married Elizabeth Purdy. They had a whole passel of children. And the oldest was the John Dixon we refer to as Father John Dixon. And he was born October 9th in Rye, New York. He was their eldest son. He was born in October of 1784. That's just, I think, 6 years after the Declaration of Independence and about 5 years before the adoption of the Constitution. So that'll put perspective on where he started. I know practically nothing about his childhood. But I do know that somewhere around 1800, he moved to New York City. Rye, New York was a farm town out in the boonies. But now it's probably the most northern suburb of the city. When he got there, he was about 18, and he took up the profession of tailor and haberdasher. And he had his shop on Chatham Street, near the intersection of Chatham Street with Oliver Street. Now, for reasons that are going to come up in a minute, I need to tell you, at that same time, there was another tailor haberdasher on Chatham Street, right next to Oliver Street. And his name was Charles Boyd. Charles Boyd was a tailor. He must have been right next to or close to John Dixon. I know almost nothing about Charles Boyd except for his relationship with John Dixon over the next 20 or 25 years. So if anybody knows of a book or pamphlet or something that will tell us about Charles Boyd, I appreciate it. I've tried the Princeton Historical Society. I've taught in several other historical societies, and I got nothing. On Oliver Street was a Baptist church, named Oliver Street Baptist Church. And John, when he was 24, on October 16, 1808, married Rebecca Sherwood. That name Sherwood passes down through our family every generation. My father was Sherwood Dixon. His grandfather was Sherwood Dixon. My son is John Sherwood Dixon. It's a magic name for us. We love it. He married Rebecca when she was 19. She was born up in Westchester County also. So I'm assuming they knew one another as young people. The two, John and Rebecca, were very active in the church. John had just been appointed as a deacon in the church. Both of them had similar passions. They were passionate about abolition. They were strong abolitionists. They always tried to promote the reading of the Bible, and they were in favor of temperance. Gets to be a little odd when they have a tavern later on and so on. Temperance doesn't necessarily mean abstinence, I guess. Moderation in everything. And surprisingly, John was elected to the first original board of directors of the New York Men's Bible Society. It's succeeded now by the American Bible Society, which is still quite active. He had a friend named Robert Fulton. I'm sure all of you have heard about Robert Fulton. Returning to my great uncle George, he was on the first trial run, okay? Was not the public commercial run. And he was also a $1 passenger on the Big Official Historic run. During my research, I found that was not true. I was able, even though I have a flip phone, I still know what the internet is. And it's tremendous in terms of research. I could actually get the list of all the passengers and crew members on the Claremont in its first commercial run, and his name is not there. So he didn't pay $1 to get on. John Dixon was one of many children, and he had a sister named Elizabeth. Now, in 1814, Elizabeth married Charles Boyd. So there must have been a good relationship between Charles and John for many years before that. I don't know what that relationship is. The history of Charles Boyd would be very helpful anyway. In New York City, John and Rebecca had 3 children. James Purdy Dixon, P-U-R-D-Y. Purdy was his grandmother's family name. John W. was the second son, and Elijah was the third son. In 1820, Dixon wanted to get out of New York. The coal smoke was getting too rough on him, and so he and Rebecca decided to go west. There was also a dispute between Deacon John and the minister at the Oliver Street Baptist Church. I don't know what that is. I have a real good guess. We don't have enough time for me to talk about that now. It's in the book. All right. So they decided to move, and just a year and a half before that, the state of Illinois was admitted to the Union, August 18, 1818. So they saw it as a land of opportunity, and they headed west. John was 36, and Rebecca was 31, so they're already a little bit older than most of the pioneers out there. James was 9, John W. was 4, and we always say John W. so we don't mix him up with his father, and Elijah was only 3. So they began their trek to the west in April of 1820. Tom has made a wonderful map you can follow. But the Dixon and Boyd families went together. They were both migrating at the same time. I don't know if the Boyds had any children. They had been married about 7 years by then, so they probably did. So I don't know if they had 1 flatboat or 2. I think it was just 1. That's what we believe. And they headed from New York to Pittsburgh with a constable wagon pulled by oxen. When they got to Pittsburgh, they bought a flatboat for $30, and they put all their shit. Now, they had been in business for quite a while, so they had furniture and other things. They didn't take that along in the wagon. They put that on a boat, sent it around to New Orleans, and it came up the Mississippi River. They came down to Cincinnati on the Ohio River, and there is a major rapids area there, so they had to hire a pilot to go around. And he took them past the rapids, and then they went on down the Ohio River, past the Wabash, and they got to Shawneetown. That was a pay anymore, they will pay it to move back to the hills. So when you go there now, it's just a little, there's nothing there. They traveled west across Illinois to the Mississippi River to a place called the Marine Settlement. Never surveyed, never incorporated. And there they picked up their furniture. And they headed a little further north to a place called Fancy Grove. My great uncle called it Fancy Creek. But it was Fancy Grove at the headwaters of a small creek, Fancy Creek, that ran 3 or 4 miles down to the Sangamon River. And it is about 7 or 8 miles north of where Springfield is right now, right next to that interstate that goes there. 3 New York families came to Fancy Grove with them. I know their names, but they're irrelevant. I don't know anything about them. Just the Phelps and the Stillmans. But the Dixon Boyd extended family started a farm. And almost immediately after that, somebody opened a dry goods store. There was a miller who would mill your grain for a percentage of the product. Sometimes, however, his horse wasn't good, so you'd have to use your horse to do the work. And there was a post office, but it was never platted, never incorporated, and there's farmland now. Very soon after that, in fact, that's early summer, another New Yorker named Oliver Kellogg, a name you historians know about, came and joined us. He was not married, and I'm assuming, the old man within me, I'm assuming that Rebecca said, well, there's a nice looking young man, good prospect, and she sent a letter home to her sister Sarah. And her sister came out and in 1822 married Oliver Kellogg. So that was the beginning of quite a group of, in an extended family. Why would you say suddenly all these New Yorkers show up there? Well, that was because the Erie Canal was not opened until 1825. And then the New Yorkers came in through the lake in Chicago. They were there for a brief period of time and ended up moving from Fancy Grove ultimately to Dixon. That 10 years period of time, 1820, 1830, was very busy for the Dixon Boyd Kellogg family. They had the farm first, and they hadn't been there very long when Dixon was asked to take some letters down to St. Louis. I think he went to Edwardsville, turned it in, and it came across. He did it several times and thought that would be a good business, so he bought a hack. A hack, if you remember, A Quiet Man, John Wayne, and what's the name? Anyway, they go out riding, according to the hack. 2-wheeled, small wagon with a driver in the front. And by about 23 or 24, John Dixon got the mail contract for Peoria to Galena. You don't know it right now. You might not know it right now, but the mail contract was a very rich business. You could make a lot of money. Among other things, there's nothing in the book about this, but you not only would buy a stagecoach, but long as you were taking people, mail, and packages. There's a lot of lumber and other stuff too. So you would have wagons and get paid to transport the heavier stuff. And so it was a very profitable business. At that time, Galena, you know, was very busy with the lead mines. People in the spring would leave Peoria, and the big obstacle to getting to Galena, where the lead mines were, was the Rock River. So it was important somehow to get across that river. And in the spring, they'd gather, and one time there was an article that I saw in the Peoria newspaper saying that there was 200 wagons waiting across the Rock River. Well, at $1 to get your wagon and your kids and your horse across the river, you would have had that here, $200 for the first group in the spring, and they're going to come back, so you're going to get another 200. And those were in the days when $200 to $150 was a year's income for most of those people out in the West. So it was a very good business. At the same time, people knew there was a little fish that looked kind of reddish, that looks like a carp, called a sucker. And the suckers went up the river streams and the little streams in the summer, and then in the winter they come back down. They migrate, just like the miners were migrating back and forth. So that's how the state of Illinois got the name of suckers. While they were in Fancy Grove, 2 children were born. Mary Lockwood Dixon. Lockwood was Rebecca's grandmother. And Franklin Dixon. I don't know anything about Franklin except he was born sometime between 22 and 25. And he died. He was living in Dixon. And he was only about 14 or 16 when he died. And that's all I know about him. They moved north in 24 because they knew the state was about to create Peoria County. Peoria being the small Illini tribe that was in that area. And so they moved knowing there was going to be the village around Fort Clark was called Peoria. And they were going to name, they were going to incorporate the town and name the county Peoria. And they saw, the family saw this as another economic opportunity. Be there right at the beginning. John Dixon was elected first county clerk when the county was created. He was also a clerk, justice of the peace, so he was well known and well liked. The hack now became a big stagecoach. If you have a stagecoach line, you need stagecoaches, you need employees, you have to have relay stations or stage stations every, depending on the topography, every 15 miles. And so you have hands, you have agents, you have wranglers, blacksmiths, lots of employees, and you're making a lot of money. When I started this research, all this stuff, the stagecoach line was new to me. I knew that there was an advertisement in a Galena newspaper about it, and so I knew he had one, but it didn't occur to me that this was such a big deal. So he moved in 1828 up to the crossroads that's now called Milo, just southwest of Princeton. And he set up his stage station there. Now he would have a cabin for his family, have to have a barn for the horses, he'd have to have a couple of employees. middle of the Peoria-Galena route. But he still had the problem of getting across the Rock River. So he talked Joseph Ogie, or as he probably called it, Auger, but we all call it Ogie now, talked him into being the agent at the Rock River. Now, Ogie failed, and as a consequence, almost every history you read about Dixon was that he was just a drunken half-breed. And that's absolutely not true. He was an agent for the American Fur Company. His preference was to hunt, trap, fish. If he was in charge of the ferry boat going across the river, he'd have to stay in one place all the time. And he didn't like it. That wasn't his nature. He wanted to be hunting and trapping. He wanted to, and that's where his money came from. So, he failed. He just wasn't there, but he had to be. And so, Dixon in 1830, and this is the anniversary, April 11, 1830, moved up to the Rock River and took over the operation of it's a grain tree. Ferry. Oh, yeah, how could I forget that? The ferry was, they're very profitable, as I told you. But the economic engine at that time was the Dixon stagecoach line. Now, the Dixons were heading to Dixon. What did they have to go through? How did they get there? What was the lay of the land during that time? One of the big things that Dixons found were swamplands. They weren't swamps like we think. Today we would call them wetlands. Everybody knows, I think, that there's a limestone ridge running behind Amboy. You know it because as you go south, there's nothing but wind farms. The wind. And along, right in fact, at the south edge of Amboy, is Green River. We call it Green River now. But then it was simply a drainage area, and when we had the winter melt and then the spring rain, those areas, the Winnebago swamp went straight south of us, and the inlet swamp, which was huge. It went all the way up, almost up to Rockford, and it was very wide. The water would collect there, and then in the fall, late summer, it would dry out. Winnebago swamp was the one that you had to have somebody make a trail to get around. You couldn't go through it. Stories of family trying to get up to Dixon, and it's late at night, and they end up going right through the swamp. There's a good story about how Father Dixon and his boys came down and they pulled him out of the swamp. We don't have time to tell you about these swamps. There's wonderful stories in my book of the Indians who were in this area when the Dixons arrived in 1830. The Ottawa Indians, surprisingly enough, were down near Ottawa, Illinois. They were heavily into agriculture. They were all along the Illinois River. They were part of the Potawatomi Nation. They have been with the Potawatomis, but not long before this had separated from the Potawatomi tribe and started their own. So when you read history from these days, you'll still see them referred to as Potawatomi. One of them, named Chattanooga, moved north he landed on surprisingly where Shallow is now. They were an agricultural people, but the Winnebago, who lived north and west of the Rock River, were still hunters and gatherers. They still did some agriculture and corn and so on, but they primarily hunters and gatherers. They did a great deal of fishing, and they are now the descendants of, what is it? The Ho-Chunk, yeah, the Ho-Chunk up in Wisconsin. Down the river at the mouth, was Saugatuck, where the Sauk Indians grew corn and so on. And they were directly related to the Fox, whose village was a little further up the river, where Prophet's town is now. White Cloud was their chief, and everybody thought he was a prophet. So he was called the Prophet, and the Prophet's town. In those days, you spelled the Sauk tribe as just S-A-C. My voice is softening up. I'll try to speak as clearly as I can. Their land was from Saugatuck at the mouth of the Rock River, all the way up the Rock River to the Horicon Marsh. They saw the Rock River as their land, their territory. By the time the Dixons arrived here, the Sauk had already been moved according to the two treaties they had in 1805 and 1850. They had already moved to Iowa. I believe they were down near the mouth of the Des Moines River, because there's a mouth line Keokuk. And that was the name of the chief. The Dixons arrived here April 11th, 1830, 194 years ago. I see I'm mayor this year, and I want the mayor, knowing now that it's getting close to the bicentennial, I want the mayor to mark his calendar when he gets back to his office. So about 4 years from now, I want him to create a bicentennial commission. Did you get that, Mr. Mayor? His wife is here. I think she'll remember to tell that. But they came down what is now Peoria Avenue. I'm sure they were right within the right-of-way of the Peoria Avenue. They came off the hill. They didn't have a railroad then, so it was a nice, smooth ride down to the river. This area was a beautiful savanna area with grass and trees right up to the river. Everybody who's anywhere here my age remembers that along the river was a railroad spur. As business began, and in my age, they were still sending trains down there to get cement at the cement plant, and then come back. Well, in order to do that, without tearing down half a block of businesses, they had to build up the riverbank. And all my life, the riverbank was a bunch of rocks and weeds, which has now changed thanks to Mayor Jim Brewer. O.G.'s cabin was there. The Dixons bought O.G.'s cabin and all the land up to about halfway between 2nd and 3rd Street. He paid $550 in 2 promissory notes. My mother had that original contract. She had a frame and she gave it to the city. So someday, go off and ask to look around the council chambers. It's probably in there. And people came in wagons and they wanted to spend $25 for a bed.
boys would be kicked out, and they could really big. They left 12 feet in between the two-story building and Moji's cabin. And so they extended the roof of the cabin, put a front and back on it, and that became the trading post and the tavern. They sold a lot of stuff. There's very interesting information about how you got across on the ferry boat, and that's all in the book. So get the book. I don't have time to tell you what 25 cents got you on the ferry boat. But I will tell you one thing that Dixon sold. He was, you know, a tailor. And the people who stayed there were not there long enough for him to make the shirt. So he would measure them, sell them the pattern for the shirt, and sell them the cloth. Women in those days were always adept at sewing, so they fold up that pattern, put it away carefully. When they got to going at it and had some time, they'd make extra shirts for the man and the kids. The day they got there were some Winnebago warriors who were inebriated, and when they saw them come, they called them out, and they wanted firewater. And he told them they had none and he wouldn't celebrate. And they got mad, and one of them had a muskrat spear. I suppose it's just a spear with a small arrow on the end. Wouldn't want anything too big for a small muskrat. And he charged Dixon because he was mad he wouldn't sell him. But his companions ran up with him and grabbed him by the arm and held him back. But John Dixon stood his ground. So that first day, he earned a reputation of being a brave man who couldn't be intimidated. A couple of days later, a Winnebago chief named Old Jaro, that's how Dixon put it in his account books, brought that young warrior to Dixon, and the young man apologized. He said he was sorry he was drinking too much. And right then, Dixon and Old Jaro agreed to a process where if any Indian came to their property and misbehaved, caused trouble, started a fight, that kind of thing, that they would be banned from coming to the tavern for a period of time. Depending on what they did, how bad it was, it could be a month, it could be 3 months. But otherwise, I think they would give it, and they agreed that they would never be overserved. Maybe 1 or 2 drinks, they were out. What those young warriors called him was man with long white hair, not a true Rasa, not a true Rasa. Just like we have nicknames, they had a process for taking the long names, and they gave names that were specific to that person, like John Dixon had long white hair. But they would take those 4 words and put them together so that it would be a shorter name, easier to say, easier to remember. And that's how I got the name Nachusa, and then how Nachusa's name is spread all over there, northwestern Illinois. The stagecoach business was still very active there. They would have had a barn and a corral and several workers. But the only thing we know directly about it was an advertisement in the Galena Miner, a newspaper up in Galena. And I think it's there on the screen that tells you can get from Galena to Peoria for only $8. Took you a couple of lovely days. You could go to Peoria, and for $3, you could go to Springfield, and for another $4 on a different stagecoach line, you could actually get all the way down to St. Louis. And our solid evidence on the stagecoach line is the advertiser was John Dixon, proprietor for the line from Galena to Springfield. At that time, John Dixon's line, as you see in the advertisement, went from Galena to Springfield. And his son, James, also got the U.S. mail contract from Dixon to Chicago. So I'm sure he got the stagecoach too and had a stop at Malugion's Grove. Everybody knows where Malugion's Grove is. And that was supposed to be funny. I had to chew you all the time. It's going to go 2 hours. James got the contract for unveiled Scott. So I think he got a Dixon's stagecoach line going too. Elijah died from somewhere, for some reason I never understood until I started the study of the stagecoach line. He died in Janesville, Wisconsin, young man, 24 years old, something like that. What the hell was he doing up in Janesville? Well, the Dixons, in a partnership with somebody up in Oregon, had a stagecoach at first that went up to Granny Tour, and then ended up in Oregon. And Elijah was up in Janesville trying to extend the stagecoach line from Dixon through Oregon, Rockford, and to Milwaukee. The stagecoach business in those days, before the 50s, when the steam engine came and blew it all away, was a very competitive business, and there were a lot of people vying for their money. Tom Wasmer has a wonderful program with pictures and everything, and he's a magical speaker. So if you ever want to get a program about the stagecoach business in northwestern Illinois, talk to Tom. He's the expert. This would be more about the stagecoaches. Just a minute. Well, they arrived in 1830, and immediately problems with the Indians came about. The Black Hawk War is about to start in 1832. The reason it's so important for Dixon is many great Americans who made their mark on our history actually came down to Dixon's Ferry in 1832. And they made friends with Dixon, with John and Rebecca Dixon. And that friendship lasted many, many years. Why these people didn't keep diaries or journals, I'll never know. They were educated, they could read, they could write very well. We sure would have a lot more answers if we could find John Dixon's journal, but he didn't do it. So that means we'll have more fun doing more research. I can't cover the Black Hawk War. It's just too much. There's a lot of books. If you get my digital book, look in the bibliography, there's a great many books about the Black Hawk War. If you look into them, you'll be amazed at what went on in this little village in that year. The first real important stories from our family point of view was the fact that Rebecca Dixon and her 3 youngest children were alone at Dixon's trading post. When she looked up one day and there was a big passing, the word I like it, I use all the time, big passing of Indians there, Black Hawk, Indian chiefs from the Ottawas, the Winnebagos, and the Fox. And they were all trying to get into her cabin. They all wanted to go in and see the cabin. And so she got Chief Crane, who was there representing the Winnebago, to help her organize it. And they set up a camp at a water run just up the road where we now have Artesian Avenue and our main mine. And if you go up there now, when they put in the railroad and when they put in the dam, the water backed up, so you can't see that little stream anymore. It's all covered up. But that's only a few minutes walk from the cabin. Every day, for 3 days, at their council fire, as they call it, every day, Rebecca would feed the chiefs in her cabin. And after she put the food on the table, she'd sit right down with the Indians, which was mind-blowing to the male Native American. The woman would actually sit right down with the men to have dinner. So, what were they there for? That was in the late fall of 1831, and Black Hawk was looking for allies, telling them he's going to come back in the spring, and he had no concept of what was going on. The agreements with the Americans that he personally had signed said that the Indians could stay in their home areas until the Americans started coming in greater numbers. And so his concept, and what he tried to sell these chiefs, was, well, they're not allowed here now. Let's just move on up, and we're going to be here, and we'll keep them from coming in. Well, Winnebago Chief Jarrell and Ottawa Chief Chabot said, no, you don't understand what's coming. You know, it's not going to work. Now, White Cloud, the prophet, agreed and was friends with Black Hawk. And he tried to tell them all that it was going to work out great, that the English were going to join them in a war against the Americans. So much for prophecy, because they certainly did. But the interesting thing out of this event is Black Hawk told people how impressed he was with Rebecca Dixon, that she was a courageous woman and had been very kind to him. We have no photograph, unfortunately, of Rebecca. She died in 1847. I don't think there were a lot of wandering photographers in northwestern Illinois in those days. And John Dixon's pictures all come from a later era. But my great-grandfather, Sherwood Dixon, or Sherwood again, described Rebecca as small of stature with no marked peculiarity. That's a very nice way of saying she was very common looking. But he went on to say, but she was intelligent, warm-hearted, tactful, and an ardent Christian. So that's about the best description we have of her. So, the war begins in 1830-31. The Americans did not forget or see what that gathering of Indians meant. It meant an Indian war in the spring. They knew that for certain. Governor Reynolds called the militia. You all know the story of Abraham Lincoln. Between Beardstown, where he was sworn in to the militia, to Fort Armstrong, which was down at the mouth of the river, where Rock Island is now. You want to go to number 12? There you go. That's Fort Armstrong. They all gathered there. The Army down in St. Louis knew just what Governor Reynolds knew about what was coming. And they prepared for a war. Now, right after this beginning, in the winter, the meeting of the Indians here was in the late fall, I think. The timeline isn't real clear. But in the winter, as the militia and the full army were getting ready, General Atkinson, in charge of about 800 regulars down in St. Louis, knew he needed information about the area. So, unlike my story in the book, he sent Lieutenant Jefferson Davis on a reconnaissance trip up to the Rock River. The main thing was to find out, well, where's the best place to make the center of our operation. He was up here in the winter and went all through the area, came down the river, and he recommended that Dixon be the center of operation, that a fort be built there. Now, I have believed for many years that he came in the early spring. The ice was too thin to get wagons and weapons across, and so he and John Dixon and the boys went out and cut slabs of ice, pulled them up further up the river, sighted them side to side, end to end, all the way across, and then poured water over it so it would freeze and it would be thick enough to hold Davis's wagons. When once you're going, let me get a little ice. So I thought he was here this early spring. In fact, he came probably in midwinter, very soon after the Indians. And that new information came to me just a few days ago from my fellow researcher, Tom Wasser. In any event, Davis found a group of pioneers waiting to get across the river. And even though it was midwinter, the ice was too thin to cross. And so, then the story, John Dixon and Jefferson Davis went out and made an ice bridge. The dates I had before Tom's information I knew were problematic, because coming up in early April, there wouldn't have been any ice at all, I don't think. A presumption on my part, but pretty good. And why would Davis take 2 or 3 trailers full of weapons and ammunition and go undefended, or only with a small platoon, up through Indian territory? Certainly he wouldn't do that, that'd be too dangerous. So the new information we received makes the timeline work better. Here's a picture of Fort Dixon. It was done at the instruction of Noah Brooks. There's something else you need to look up on the internet. Noah Brooks worked at the newspaper here at Dixon's Ferry for 3 or 4 years. He then moved to Washington, became a very good friend of Abe Lincoln, did wonderful things during the Civil War with Grant. But while he was still here, before he left, he hired somebody from Chicago to come out and make this drawing. You can see there's a berm around it. There's a small building where they kept their weapons and ammunition. They didn't want to put them in the big fort, because if there was any kind of fire, it would blow up and kill the men in the fort. But they built a 2-story fort with slits on the side as firing windows. That lasted until about 1845, when they burned it down and used it for construction of homes. Behind the berms, they put logs. So if they were attacked, they could immediately pick up a log or two, put it on top of the berm, and they would be able to kneel and fire and have greater protection. I'm told I'm about out of time, so we're going to go quickly through the next 3. The next one is a painting of Fran Swarbrick hanging on the wall out here. I love Fran. It was done in 1995. And it's just as I imagined Fort Dixon would look if they had a platoon called up in the morning. The next slide is those who served. It would take me an hour to cover all that. Zachary Scott was up in Detroit. He was going to be the commander. But he left with 1,000 regulars. When he got to Chicago, there was a cholera epidemic, and he did not make it. He lost quite a few men. He later was in charge of the army in the Mexican-American War, coming from the north, going south into Mexico. Zachary Taylor was a colonel, and very important. And later he was with the American troops that came in to Mexico and fought their way up north to Mexico City. Later the two had a big fight. As Democrats, I think, as to who would get the nomination for president, Zachary Taylor won that and became president. Winfield Scott was the general-in-chief in 1860 when the Civil War started. Lieutenant Joseph Johnson was with Winfield Scott in Detroit, never made it here. He was a general in the Confederacy. He was in charge of the last full army in the Civil War. He surrendered in North Carolina to Sherman, and they became lifelong friends right after Grant surrendered at Appomattox. Davis, was president of the Confederacy. He did not go up right away with the army when it went north of the river. His job was to be in charge of Fort Dixon, and periodically, I think every 2 or 3 days, he had to take a tour through northwestern Illinois to see if any of the Indians came back, if there was any activity. When he did that, who would go along with him as a guide? But John Dixon. And I have another research project, but I think Abraham Lincoln's company was kept here too. And he went up with Jefferson. Of course, a lieutenant in the regular army would have nothing to do with a captain of the militia. So I don't think that established any particular relationship. You gotta take the cap off his head. Interestingly, also here was Lieutenant Robert Anderson. Do you know where he was? the day the Civil War started?
I know.
He was in Charleston, South Carolina. He was a major who was in charge of Fort Sumter. He was a huge hero. And when Fort Sumter was over, they sent all the Yankees north, and he was hailed as a hero in all the newspapers, parades for him, and he was invited to talk to President Lincoln. When he walked in to President Lincoln's office, Lincoln said, "Well, Major Anderson, we've met. Do you remember?" And Anderson said, No, I don't remember, sir." And Lincoln said, "I was a private." Remember, he came back as a private. And I was a private in the militia at Dixon's Ferry during the Black Hawk Wars, and you swore in to military service. So, we did a lot of research on that, and I'm pretty sure it's Anderson or Davis would probably be in the group while they were being sworn in. But my family, I always grew up with the oddity that Jefferson Davis swore in Abraham Lincoln. Not true, but really close. I'm going to have to leave a lot more of this. The time is almost up. I'm going to have to leave a lot more of this for you to read in the book. But there are a couple more things I want to cover before we start. John Dixon did a lot for the Army. He was an interpreter, a guide, an advisor. He provided beef and other necessities for the Army. He ran a herd of beef all the way up into Wisconsin for the troops. The interesting thing is, he spent a lot of time with Davis and Anderson and Zachary Taylor, and later when Winfield Scott got there and spent almost a year negotiating payments for the Winnebago and the Iowa for the help. He spent a lot of time. So these people at various times went hunting, fishing, they sat at John and Rebecca Dixon's table, they got to know very well. One story to support that was 38 to 41. John Dixon wanted the federal land laws to be moved from Galena to Dixon. Very profitable to have a land office in your town, because anybody who wanted to get a land grant license or that kind of thing, or make a payment, had to come to Dixon if he got it. Well, how did he do it? He went to Washington, D.C. Who was there? General of the Army, Winfield Scott, and General Zachary Taylor. So he just went to see them. They said, "Why, sure, you ought to have that." And the two of them walked them up to the White House. They sat down with President Van Buren and had a nice lunch. And when he left, Van Buren said, "We'll change it down to Dixon." Now, no notice in the Federal Journal, no hearings, no nothing. I think the Congress was probably just as surprised as the people up in Galena when they suddenly found out their profitable office was being moved away. And I don't know if I want to read it all, but in slide number 18, there's an example of the intelligence he provided. When you get the book, you can read this. It's a letter that John Dixon wrote to, he called General Stillman. Well, he had a ragtag group of about 100 militia from Iowa. He was by no means a general, but an officer in the militia, you almost try to cover up if you can. But he told him that Black Hawk and his band had just come up the river. Dixon sent his wife and his 3 younger children to Galena. She and Sarah Kellogg and her children went up there to be safe. But Dixon and his 2 boys and his employees stayed and were working there so that he could report to the Ottawa militia coming up that that Black Hawk had gone by 500 horses, 100 canoes, about 500, not counting another group that was going to come, which would be the women and children. They professed to be friendly, but I don't know what they're doing. So he told them where they were going to be, about 12 miles from here upstream. So that's how Dixon served the Army and got the gratitude of the country, which is going to come up in a minute. I'm sorry we're going to go over, but I'll try to do it. The next item is very interesting. It's about how John Dixon lost everything. He was very prominent in politics and business. And so in 1827, the state legislature voted a $10 million bond for state improvements. This improvement program was to clean rivers, create canals, get railroad rights away, and build railroad what do you call those railroad beds. And he was appointed to be in charge of the Northwest Tourist. He had to give him a bond, but he was in charge. The biggest project in this area was to come with a railroad from Ottawa through Amboy, Dixon, Fulton, up to Galena. And workers began from either end. And they got the rights away. They hired contractors to do the work. And Governor Duncan vetoed it. He said, we don't have enough money. Now, sure enough, looking a little bit ahead, by 1840, the state reached a point where it couldn't meet the bond payment. And the state of Illinois was essentially bankrupt. There's no banking system. In fact, banks were the ones that issued paper money. There was no way for Dixon to get the money he needed to pay the contractor unless he reviewed all the contracts, approved them, and took it to the new capital, which had just moved from Kaskaskia to Springfield. And he would have to go down there himself, collect cash, and bring it back. So he did that. He gave his warrants in the spring for all the stuff that had been done throughout the year, and he couldn't go. So in 1839, he sent his most trusted clerk, Oliver Hamlin, and what is now Tom as being the Warren Hamlin affair. And he was sent down to Springfield to bring the money back. He turned the warrants into the comptroller's office, went across to the treasurer's office. This is what now we call the old Capitol. And he picked up the money at the treasurer's office and was last seen leaving the treasurer's office with $11,500 in cash. $11,500 now would be hundreds of thousands of dollars. So first thing Dixon found out about it was he got a letter. When you get the book and read the letter and you see it makes no sense. Because at one point said what he decided was to go back down to Louisville. What had he been in Louisville for? Springfield was north, Dixon. Louisville south. When had he gone to Louisville? Anyway, read this sad letter. How upset and planning he was that he played poker on the boat going back up the Mississippi River and lost all the money. Very interesting. And he ended up with his letter by saying, I don't know what to say. Well, James Dixon and Smith Galbraith went chasing him all over Canada, New England. They got down to New Orleans, and the only thing they could find out was people told them that Hamlin and his family got in a ship to South America. There's another story that I got into that suggests that sometime he came back. I'll read the book for that. So he lived in reduced circumstances from the 1840s until he died in 1876. The bondholders, of course, paid off the $11,500, and they promptly started taking, liquidating Dixon's property. It included all the assets of the stagecoach lines, his home, a farm he owned, and other land, including he still had 65 lots in that first subdivision north of the river. So by 1842 or something, Rebecca and John had lost everything. But John would live for another 37 years. At one point, I'd like to say this in the book, but I gotta tell you, in 1860, his friends filed a petition in Congress to get a land grant of 160 acres, so he could sell and have something to live on, because he was broke. The Illinois Senator, Lyman Trumbull, pressed it forward and was in charge of the committee that had to review it and approve it for Congress. But because he was chairman of the committee, he couldn't be a witness. And he needed at least one witness. So who did he find in the spring of '86? With a senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, who came, and in the book you see the whole transcript of his testimony. And he testified that John Dixon was a reliable person who helped open the West and served faithfully and well in the Black Hawk War. Rebecca died in '47. John W., her second son, died only 2 months later. And so John, who was now all alone, moved in with his daughter-in-law, Elizabeth, and she was John's sister. Anyway, he moved in with her and her daughter, Frances Louise, who our family always just called Louise, who ended up living until 1913. But at the time, Louise was 2 years old, and she spent until 1876 supporting and taking care of her grandfather. Sorry about the voice. I'll try to speak up. Another thing that, in fact, there's no slide on, but another thing that was, to me, I had read an article in the Dixon paper in 1852. Some of you might remember that that was the year that they had the Bloomington Convention, out of which came the Illinois Republican Party. I grew up having seen that as a very young man, thinking that John Dixon was the presiding officer of that convention. And then he made a big speech. Well, he made a big speech. Research on the internet gives you everything. And I found out who all of the delegates were. Well, not all bad. John Dixon was 72 years old. He was very popular and well-known, and he was actually invited to the convention to make a speech. But the newspaper article refers to him as the old pioneer John Dixon was, he didn't say elected, he was appointed president of the convention and made a rousing speech. Well, that was just boosterism from a local newspaper. Saying he was in charge. Well, he was well appreciated, and that's why he could still be called the foremost gentleman, the foremost citizen of Northwest India. Now, John Dixon died Rebecca, I'll tell you first, Rebecca died in 1847. 2 months later, her son John died, and John moved in to live with his daughter-in-law. And then he died February 1876. He had a stroke. The report from the Dixon Sun was so florid, unbelievable. They said on May, whatever it was, the old ferryman cut the line from the riverbank and floated to eternity. And they had a huge resolution that the city council passed, and everybody came to sign it. And it too was even more florid. They had him as one of the greats in the pantheon of American history. They equated him with George Washington. It'd be nice if we could say we are up there in our history with George Washington. But it shows what he was to the people around him at the time. When he died, just after the centennial, July 6th or 7th, 1876, the reaction of the media, church bells rang, public buildings and businesses downtown were all draped in black crepe. They built a platform in front of the old courthouse. This is not the current one. But they built a platform there and put his casket. They said as many as 10,000 came the Sunday following his death. Well, we can't account for the number, but the crowd was huge. And in those days when speakers could throw their voice a great distance, the people in the back could not hear the speaker. So it was a large crowd. There were civic bands that came. Every town, every village had a band. There was a band from Rochelle, from Moorhead, from Sterling. They all came. Speakers talked for a good deal of time. The Knights Templar provided an honor guard, and after all the speeches, they paraded up to Oakwood Cemetery, where John, Rebecca, and Elijah are still buried. Can't miss it when you drive in. Just a couple of weeks after his death, the Winnebago, who were accustomed to coming down every year, came down the rock and went up to the house. And spent about a week or so talking about told stories of the old day and John Dixon, what he was to the Native Americans. I'm going to tell you something that's the last thing, if you did any end with me. When Louise Dixon, not you, my sister, but our first cousin, 3 times removed, Frances Louise Dixon, was age 12. She wrote an essay for a school program, and she had to read it to the gathering, among whom was her grandfather. Now, this is going to be unusual, I think, and if you'll bear with me and help me, I'd appreciate it. Louise was the daughter of my great-great-grandfather, John W. So he was my first cousin, thrice removed. And even though it's 167 years ago, because I discovered that relationship and have been thinking about it, it made me feel very connected, and I get a little emotional. I think I first read this when I came back from law school in the 60s. And I think every time I read it, I get emotional. And at 85, that's even worse. But I know a lot of you are grandparents. And you probably have had, no more because of her current age, but at one time I had a granddaughter who wrote something very nice about that and said it in public. So I think for years now, whenever I read this, I get choked up. So when I get choked up, I'm going to give you a signal. And I want you to read, to help me. Read it out loud. Agreed? Okay. Here we go. The last story. My grandfather. Long ago, my grandfather left the city of New York and came west to reside. The facilities for traveling in those days were not as speedy as they are now. He traveled on what is termed a mover wagon. Never heard that term before. And was 72 days on the road. When my grandfather first settled in this state, the family was obligated to live in their wagon until trees were cut down and formed into houses. My grandfather lived there some years with no other neighbors than the wild Indians. But savage as they were, he was treated kindly. A few years since, a party of his Indian friends came to visit him. They encamped opposite his house, which we always call the Louise Dixon house. They encamped opposite house, and every day came to see him. They stayed nearly 2 weeks, and then to their apartment. Since then, an old Indian chief, Shadow, was twice been here to see him, and has stayed overnight at our house. Since grandfather left his city home, many changes have taken place. Then he was surrounded by many bright and happy faces. Now they're all gone, and he's left quite alone. Grandfather is now an old man. His hair is whitened with the frost of 70 winters. His form is not quite as erect as it was on. Let's all read it. Yet my grandfather is very cheerful. He sometimes tells us some of the images in which I hear us I could listen for hours without being tired. I love my grandfather very much. He was very dear to me. I often wonder, all grandfathers are like mine. And still gets choked up. I wonder what I did to John Dixon. And this is the last story. The next slide is going to be a picture of John Dixon, and under it will be my email address at comcast.net. If you'd like to have the book free of charge to fill in all the things I couldn't cover, feel free to do so. Thank you and good night. I'll stay around for questions.